All right, get ready because today we're going deep, really deep into qualia.
Qualia, huh?
Yeah, qualia. And lucky for us, you're a philosopher, so we can kind of skip all that consciousness 101 stuff.
Sounds good to me.
Right. We're using the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy's entry on qualia, and let me tell you, it is dense.
Oh, it's a big one, for sure.
Oh, yeah. We're talking about that raw feel of experience, the redness of a rose, the sting of a burn, even like the ha moment when you finally understand a tough concept.
It's those subjective, phenomenal aspects of experience. They're so interesting, but also,
Baffling.
yeah, baffling. So interesting and baffling, those intrinsic qualities.
It's really at the heart of what makes consciousness such a puzzle.
Exactly.
So the Stanford Encyclopedia goes into all sorts of different ways philosophers define qualia. But for our deep dive, let's just stick with that broad definition, like what it's like to actually have an experience.
Okay, I like it.
So then the big question is, which mental states actually have qualia? Sensations like pain or colors, those seem obvious. But what about thoughts?
Ah, yeah, see, that's where things get really interesting, for philosophers especially, because, I mean, we all have that sense of an inner world, right?
Right.
And Galen Strawson, he argues that thoughts themselves have this phenomenal character, a kind of qualia, you could say, thought qualia.
So it's not just like the visual image of a dog that has qualia, but like the very thought dog itself has its own feel.
Yes, precisely. Think about, like, when you're trying to grasp a complex philosophical argument, that ha moment, the pieces all clicking into place.
Oh, yeah.
That feeling, that's what Strawson's talking about. That's thought experience.
Okay, I think I'm with you, but some folks would probably say that that feeling of understanding, it's coming from other associated qualia.
Oh, for sure.
Like, the visual memory of reading the words on the page, or even that subtle tension in your forehead when you're concentrating.
Right. Yeah, you're always going to have that question. Like, can you actually separate thought qualia from all the sensory stuff that comes along with it?
It's a tough one.
It's a really tough one.
Yeah. And this kind of leads us straight into the main event here. Are qualia reducible to the physical world? Can something as, immaterial as the feeling of redness really be explained by neurons firing in your brain?
Ah, yes, the mind-body problem. It always comes back to this, doesn't it?
It really does.
And that's why we have these thought experiments. Frank Jackson's Mary the Color Scientist.
Oh,
yeah, she's a classic. They really get us thinking.
Right. She's stuck in that black and white room, knows everything about color, but she's never actually seen it.
Right.
So does she learn something new when she finally sees that red apple?
Yeah, it's a good one.
That's the question.
Yes, if she does, then there's something more to color than just the physical facts, and that would be a big problem for physicalism.
It wouldn't it? So how do the physicalists deal with this one? They can't just throw in the towel because of one color-deprived scientist.
Of course not. They've got a few tricks up their sleeves. One response is the ability hypothesis,
Okay.
which says that knowing what it's like to see red is really about knowing how to do stuff related to the experience. Mary could, learn to identify red objects or even imagine a red sunset, all from within her monochrome world.
That's true, but it seems like that misses something, doesn't it?
It does.
Like, I could train a computer to pick out red objects based on wavelength data, but we wouldn't say the computer knows what it's like to see red, would we?
You're exactly right. It's a great objection to the ability hypothesis. Even with all that functional knowledge, Mary's still missing that immediate subjective experience.
Right, she's missing the what it's likeness.
Right, exactly.
Okay, so then there's the phenomenal concept hypothesis, another attempt to square Mary's new knowledge with physicalism.
Right, this one says that when Mary sees red, she's not getting new factual knowledge. She's gaining a new phenomenal concept.
Okay, but isn't that kind of just pushing the problem back a step? What even are these phenomenal concepts and how do they fit into a physical world?
Yeah, I think it get really tricky there. Some philosophers would say they're just a different way to access physical information, but others see them as something totally different.
Yeah.
It gets messy.
And then, of course, you have philosophers like Chalmers, right? He'd just flat out say, Mary shows us that qualia can't be explained just by physical facts.
Yeah,
He'd say the whole idea of a phenomenal concept is just misleading.
Right, like trying to fit a square peg in a round hole.
Yeah, exactly. It's like trying to explain the taste of chocolate by listing out its chemical composition. You're just not capturing that essence of the experience itself.
Exactly.
All right, well, the Stanford Encyclopedia throws another wrench into things. Philosophical zombies. Break that one down for us.
Okay, so imagine a being that's physically identical to you, down to the last neuron,
Okay.
but there's no conscious experience.
Oh.
It acts just like you, talks like you, but there's no one home.
Okay, so a perfect imitation, but without the subjective feel of anything.
Exactly. It's a creepy thought.
Yeah. But if zombies are even conceivable, wouldn't that mean qualias aren't just physical?
Absolutely. That's a huge challenge to physicalism. If qualia were just a product of the physical, then a zombie, A physically identical zombie.
Would have them too?
Exactly. The fact that we can even imagine a zombie, some argue, shows qualia have to be something more than just the physical.
Okay, so how do the physicalists deal with that one? Do they just say, fine, maybe there are zombies?
Well, some might, but a common response is to say that zombies are conceptually possible, sure, but they're not metaphysically possible. Like maybe there are hidden dependencies between physical states and conscious experience that we just haven't figured out yet.
So they're saying just because we can't explain it now doesn't mean it's not ultimately physical.
Right. It's a hope that we'll figure it out eventually.
A persistent hope.
Very persistent hope.
All right, let's move on to some theories that try to explain qualia. Starting with functionalism.
Okay.
Stanford Encyclopedia, it lays out the basics. Qualias aren't defined by their physical stuff, but by their functional role in the system.
Right. So like pain to a functionalist, it's not about specific nerves firing. It's about whatever state is usually caused by tissue damage and then causes that withdrawal behavior. It's the function that matters, not the specific physical thing doing it.
Right, I gotcha. Pretty elegant approach.
It is.
But there's some serious problems with it, right?
Oh, yeah, for sure. One of the most famous is the inverted spectrum thought experiment. So the inverted spectrum, it's this classic thought experiment that really challenges functionalism. The idea is you could have two people and their color experiences are totally inverted.
Inverted.
Yeah, flipped. But they still function in exactly the same way.
So like, I see green when you see red, but we both still call the graphs green and stop signs red.
Exactly. And if that's possible, then functional roles can't be the whole story when it comes to qualia, right?
Yeah, because if qualia were all about function, then our totally different experiences of color.
They'd have to show up somehow.
Yeah, like we'd act differently or interact with the world differently. But in the thought experiment, we don't.
Exactly. The inverted spectrum really suggests there's something about that subjective quality of experience that just goes beyond its function. Throws a wrench in the whole functionalist thing.
It does. So how do functionalists try to get around this? Do they just say, yeah, maybe some people do see the world with inverted colors?
Some do, actually, but others, they try to find ways to make functionalism work even if inverted spectra are possible.
Okay, how?
Well, one argument is that even if two people have the same broad functions, might be subtle differences in how their brains are actually processing the information.
So like underlying differences, even if it doesn't show up in how we act.
Exactly. Kind of like, two different computer programs that produce the same output.
Right, but they use different code to get there.
Right. So the functionalist might say, even with the same overall behavior, you could have variations in the mechanisms that are actually causing the experience, the qualia. And those internal differences, they could explain why the qualia are different, even if they don't lead to any functional differences that we could actually observe.
Clever. Still seems like a bit of a patch job, though. And then there's the absent qualia hypothesis, right?
Ah, yes. This one really gets to the heart of whether functionalism can really capture conscious experience.
It's the idea that you could have a system that does everything a brain does, but it has no qualia at all, like a really advanced AI that can pass the Turing test, but there's no one inside actually experiencing anything.
You got it. And Ned Block's China brain thought experiment that really illustrates this. Imagine 1 billion people in China, each with a radio.
Okay.
And they're all simulating the connections between neurons in a human brain.
Whoa, a giant brain made of people.
Right, it's wild. But the point is, even if the system could perfectly copy what a human brain does, would it have conscious experiences? Would there be qualia?
That's the big question.
And Block says no. He says you can have function without qualia, which is like a huge blow to functionalism.
Yeah, because if qualia were just about functional roles, then the China brain, as complex as it is, it should have them too.
Exactly. The absent qualia hypothesis really throws a wrench in the whole thing.
So how do functionalists respond to that?
Well, one response is that maybe a system as complex as the China brain would have to have qualia, even if we can't imagine it. Like maybe consciousness emerges once you hit a certain level of complexity, no matter what the system's made of.
So they're saying our intuition that the China brain isn't conscious, that's just because it's so weird and huge?
Right. Maybe we just can't grasp what consciousness would be like in a system like that, but it's there.
Bold claim. Not sure I buy it, but it's interesting. All right, let's talk about the explanatory gap. That's a big one.
Ah, yeah, the explanatory gap. This one's a real head-scratcher. Even if we knew everything about the brain, down to the tiniest detail.
You're saying we still couldn't explain how that physical stuff produces the experience of, like, tasting pineapple or feeling love.
Exactly. We might be able to say, okay, when this part of the brain does this thing, the person feels joy. But we still can't explain how those physical processes actually create that feeling.
Yeah, it's like there's a missing step.
It's a huge leap.
So what are the different takes on this gap? Do some people think we just can't cross it?
Oh, absolutely. Some philosophers, like Chalmers and
We've
Jackson,
talked about them.
yeah, they'd say the explanatory gap is a fundamental problem, that it shows us there's this basic difference between the physical world and conscious experience.
So they'd say consciousness is fundamental, not just something that comes from matter.
Yeah, like we need to rethink our whole picture of the universe to make room for consciousness.
Interesting.
And then you have others like Colin McGinn. He says the gap is unbridgeable too, but not because consciousness is something totally separate.
Okay.
He thinks it's just a limit of our brains. Like we're just not equipped to understand the connection between the physical and the phenomenal.
Like a dog trying to do calculus.
Exactly.
So it's not that the gap can't be bridged in principle, it's just that we can't bridge it.
Right. He calls it cognitive closure. We're closed off from a certain kind of understanding, not because reality is hiding something, but because our minds just can't get there.
I get it. But some people think we can bridge the gap, right?
Oh, yeah, there's a lot of hope out there that maybe with new scientific discoveries, new concepts, we'll figure out how consciousness emerges from the physical world.
They're hoping for that grand unified theory.
The theory of everything,
Right.
mind and matter all together.
Optimistic. And then there are the folks who think the explanatory gap is an illusion.
Right, like Dennett and Ty, they argue that once we really understand the
The
brain,
mystery of consciousness will disappear.
yeah, they think our whole idea of qualia is messed up.
So we're basically getting in our own way.
Exactly. Making things too complicated. They think once we have a clearer picture of the brain, we'll see that qualias aren't this big mystery after all.
Bold claim. I guess we'll see. All right, let's get into some theories that try to explain what qualia actually are, starting with representationalism.
Okay, representationalism.
It says that qualias are really just a type of representational content. So instead of these mysterious things, they're just information about the world.
Exactly. And one of the cool things about representationalism is that it can explain why we can have these experiences that seem very similar, even if they're not actually about the same thing in the world.
Like seeing a real apple versus hallucinating an apple.
Right. In both cases, your experience represents redness.
Right.
Even though there might not actually be a red apple.
And it can explain things like phantom limb pain.
Yes, where you feel pain in a limb that's not even there.
Right, because your experience is still representing pain even though there's no physical cause.
Exactly. Traditional qualia theories, they have trouble with that.
They do. So representationalism, it seems pretty powerful.
It does.
But are there different kinds of representationalism? I remember the Stanford Encyclopedia mentioned something about levels of content.
You're right. It's clear that not all content is the same when it comes to qualia.
Right.
I mean, we have all sorts of beliefs and thoughts that are about the world, but they don't have that what it's like quality.
Yeah, like I can believe that water boils at 100 degrees Celsius, but it doesn't feel like anything the way experiencing the heat of boiling water does.
Exactly. So for representationalists, the question is, what kind of content is actually responsible for qualia?
Is there an answer?
Not a simple one, unfortunately. Different philosophers have different ideas. Some focus on low-level sensory representations.
The stuff our senses give us before we even know what we're seeing or hearing.
Yeah, that raw data. So it's not conceptual yet, but it might be crucial for creating the feeling of the experience. Others think that higher-level stuff like concepts are important too. Like seeing a dog isn't just about the visual features, it's also about your concept of dog.
So all our background knowledge, our beliefs, even our culture, that could shape how an experience feels.
It could. It gets really interesting when you think about cultural differences in perception.
Yeah, maybe people from different cultures with different ways of understanding the world, maybe they actually have different qualia, even when they're looking at the same thing.
That's a wild thought, right? But of course, representationalism has its problems.
It does.
Oh, yeah. One big problem is that sometimes experiences with different qualia seem to have the same content.
Wait, so two experiences that feel completely different could actually be representing the same thing.
Right, and there's this thought experiment, Inverted Earth, that really highlights this. Imagine a planet where all the colors are the opposite of ours. Sky is yellow, grass is red.
My brain hurts already.
Right, now imagine you go to Inverted Earth and you get these special lenses in your eyes that flip the colors back so everything looks normal to you at first.
So I'm seeing blue sky, even though it's actually yellow, because the lenses are correcting for it.
Right. But as you live on Inverted Earth, your brain adjusts. You start to think of the sky as yellow, even though it still looks blue to you because of the lenses.
So my concept of sky has changed, but the qualia, the blue feeling, hasn't.
Exactly. And this is a problem for representationalism, because if qualia are just representational content, then your qualia should have changed when your concept of sky changed.
Right. Inverted Earth makes it seem like maybe qualia are more than just what experiences represent?
Yeah, a lot of people think so. And there are other thought experiments like Swamp Man.
What, man?
Swamp Man, it's about this creature that's identical to you, down to the atom,
Uh-huh.
but it spontaneously forms in a swamp.
Okay, this is getting weird.
Right, it's called Swamp Man, and the question is, does Swamp Man have the same qualia as you?
I don't know, does it?
Well, some philosophers say no, because Swampman doesn't have your history. It didn't grow up like you. It didn't learn like you.
So even though it's physically the same, its experiences don't have the same meaning.
Right. Its qualia would be different because it lacks that background that shaped your qualia.
Okay, so representationalism has some serious challenges.
It does.
But are there other theories that say qualia are intrinsic properties of experience, without relying on content?
There are. These theories usually emphasize two things. First, they say experience isn't transparent. Like, when we introspect, we don't just see through our experiences to the world.
Okay,
There's something about the experience itself that we're aware of, not just the stuff we're experiencing.
so there's a kind of thisness to experience, a quality that's just there, not about anything else.
Exactly. And second, they hold on to this idea called the common kind assumption. It's the idea that real experiences, like seeing a real apple, and hallucinatory experiences, like seeing an imaginary apple, they can share the same qualia.
So the feeling of redness could be the same, even if one's real and one isn't.
Right. They're saying the feel itself can be the same, even if the cause is different. And that's important for defending intrinsic qualia. If real and hallucinatory experiences had totally different qualia, then why would they feel the same to the person having them?
Makes sense. So these theories are trying to make room for qualia as, the basic building blocks of experience, separate from what those experiences are about.
Exactly. They see qualia as those raw feels that make up our conscious lives, regardless of what they represent.
It's a bold move, but it must face its own challenges.
Oh, of course. Like, if qualia are these intrinsic properties, how do they relate to the physical world? How do they fit into science?
That's the big question, isn't it?
It is, and it's a question that keeps philosophers arguing.
We've only just scratched the surface here.
Yeah, we have.
There's so much more to explore.
There is. And the Stanford Encyclopedia, it has even more perspectives to consider, like relational theories of qualia, which take a very different approach.
Relational theories, huh? Tell me more.
So relational theories, they move away from that idea of qualia as like these isolated things inside your head.
Okay.
Instead, they say qualia are about the relationship between the experiencer, the object, and the whole context of the experience.
So it's not just what's going on in my head. It's also about how I'm interacting with the world, my perspective, my history, all that stuff.
Exactly. The standpoint of the experience, it includes things like, what senses you're using, where you are in space and time, what you're focusing on.
Mm-hmm.
Even your background knowledge and beliefs, it all shapes the qualia.
Okay, so give me an example.
Okay, let's stick with our red apple. A relational theorist would say that the qualia of seeing that apple, it's not just about the redness of the apple itself. It's also about your viewpoint, the lighting, how far away you are from the apple, even your past experiences with apples.
So even the same apple could produce different qualia for different people, or even for the same person at different times.
Exactly. And that helps explain why our experiences are so rich and varied.
Yeah, that makes sense. But how do you even define the standpoint of an experience? It seems like it could get pretty complicated.
It does. Which factors matter? How much do they contribute? It gets messy fast. And then there's the question of hallucinations.
Oh, right. How do they deal with experiences where there's no actual object there?
Some relational theorists, they bring in representational content for hallucinations.
Okay.
They might say that the qualia of a hallucination are determined by what the experience is representing, even if it's not really there.
So it's kind of a mix of relationalism and representationalism.
Right, but others argue that the qualia of hallucinations are just like fundamentally the same as the qualia of real experiences.
But then how do we know if we're hallucinating? If they feel the same, how can we tell the difference?
Yeah, that's tricky. Relational theorists have to do some work to address that. They might talk about like the overall coherence of our experiences or the role of feedback from the world.
Okay, so there are some issues to work out,
There are, yeah.
but it seems like relational theories, they really try to connect qualia to our, embodied experience in the world.
They do, and they raise this really interesting possibility that maybe qualia aren't as private and subjective as we think. Maybe they're more tied to the world, to our interactions with it.
That's a cool thought. So we've talked about representationalism, intrinsic property theories, relational theories. Now, what about illusionism? That's a pretty wild one.
Ah, yes, illusionism. Now we're getting into some controversial territory.
Wait on me.
Illusionism basically says that qualia, and maybe even consciousness itself, are illusions.
Wait, hold on. So you're saying, The warmth of the sun, the taste of coffee, the joy of listening to music, all that's just an illusion.
That's what they're saying. They argue that even though it feels like we have these rich subjective experiences, it's just a trick
A trick of the mind.
of the mind. In reality, there's no what it's like to experience anything.
Whoa. How could they just deny something that feels so real?
They say that introspection, how we look inward at our experiences, is misleading. It gives us a distorted view.
So it's like we're looking at a mirage, we think we see water, but it's just a trick of the light.
Yeah, good analogy. They say our brains are wired to create this illusion of conscious experience, maybe because it was useful for survival way back when.
Okay, but if there are no qualia, then what's happening when we have these experiences?
Most illusionists, no functionalists at heart. They say our brains are just complex information processors, and conscious experience is just a label for certain functions.
So my experience of red, it's just a name for what my brain's doing, but there's no actual feeling of red going on.
That's the basic idea. They think once we understand the brain well enough, we won't need qualia or even consciousness anymore. We'll see that it was all just a story we told ourselves.
That's a lot to take in. I'm not sure I'm convinced.
Yeah, it's a hard one to swallow, but illusionism, it makes you think.
It does. So representationalism, intrinsic properties, relational theories, illusionism. What else does the Stanford Encyclopedia talk about?
There's a couple more. One is Russellian monism.
Russellian monism. Okay, I'm listening.
So this one comes from Bertrand Russell, who was pretty skeptical of the whole physicalist thing. The basic idea is that the most basic stuff in the universe, the building blocks of reality, they have properties that go beyond what physics can describe.
So there's more to reality than what our science can currently see.
That's the core of Russellian monism. They call these extra properties quiddities.
Quiddities, okay.
And some Russellian monists think that some quiddities are essential for consciousness.
So maybe these quiddities are what make qualia possible, like the missing piece connecting matter and consciousness.
Exactly. It's a way to bridge the gap, but without giving up on the idea that the physical world is fundamental.
Okay, but if these quiddities are so important, why can't science find them?
Good question. Some say our instruments aren't sensitive enough. Others say our theories are incomplete.
Like we're missing a piece of the puzzle.
Exactly. And that missing piece could be a key to understanding how subjective experience comes from the objective world.
So Russellian monism, it's pushing us to think outside the box.
It is.
To imagine that the universe might be more than we currently understand.
For sure. But it has its challenges, like any theory of consciousness.
Such as?
Well, there's the combination problem. If qualia come from these quiddities, how do the quiddities of all the tiny particles in our brains combine to create a single unified experience? Like, how do we go from tiny properties to big, complex feelings?
That's a big jump.
It is. Russellian monists are still working on that one.
Okay, so there's still a lot to figure out. But it's a fascinating approach. Really gets you thinking.
Definitely. And before we wrap up, the Stanford Encyclopedia also mentions this question that I find really interesting.
Oh, what is it?
Which creatures experience qualia?
Ah, the animal consciousness question. Do dogs have qualia? What about fish? Or insects? Where do we draw the line?
It's a big question, philosophically and ethically.
It is. I've always wondered about my cat. He seems pretty conscious.
Right.
But what about a spider? Or a worm? It's hard to know what's going on in other minds, especially ones so different from ours.
It is, and that's where representationalism can be helpful.
Oh, yeah, remind me how that works.
Well, representationalism says that qualia are a kind of content that can influence beliefs and desires. So it's not just about having a sensory experience, it's about being able to use that experience to think, learn, and make choices.
So it's about having a certain level of intelligence.
Right. Creatures that can't reason or learn, they might not have qualia. They might react to things, but it might be purely automatic without any feeling.
So a simple organism that just reacts to its environment, it might not have the same kind of experience as an animal that can learn and solve problems.
That's the idea. Like, take plants, they do all sorts of complex things, but it's mostly pre-programmed. They don't learn the same way animals do. So a plant might not have qualia because it can't integrate its experiences into a bigger picture, into beliefs and desires.
It can't use those experiences to guide its actions in a flexible way.
Right. So qualia, they might be more common in the animal kingdom than we realize, but they might not be universal.
Wow, this is really making me think differently about qualia and about consciousness in general.
It's a huge topic, a lot to consider.
Well, my brain is definitely full. This deep dive has been a wild ride.
It has. We've covered so much, all these different theories, these mind-bending thought experiments.
And we've wrestled with that explanatory gap. That's a tough one.
Yeah, the relationship between mind and matter, it's a mystery that keeps on giving.
It does.
But I think the biggest takeaway here is that qualia, they're still one of the most fundamental and challenging questions in philosophy.
They make you question everything you thought you knew.
They really do. So, to our philosopher listener out there, we'll leave you with this thought. If even simple experiences, like seeing a red rose, can be so philosophically puzzling, what other mysteries of consciousness are out there waiting to be discovered?
And what does the existence of qualia tell us about our place in the universe? There's so much more to explore.
There is. Keep questioning, keep exploring, and until next time, happy pondering.